Everyone thinks I'm podcasting from like a cabin.
Terrible coffee or something.
I always throw up the Unabomber's shed.
Yeah. I podcast from a 10 by 16 shed in my backyard that I converted half into an office.
And there's dynamite under it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Welcome to Namely 90s. Wow. The podcast that takes you back to the time before smartphones, Google, and Y2K. Join your hosts as they relive the pop culture that shaped a generation and the parts that many people wish they could forget. Listen in to the conversation about how the decade defined those who spent their childhood there and how it shaped them as adults. So, turn down the grunge and dial up the internet. Let's get started. It's time for Namely 90s.
That's right. You're listening to Namely 90s. My name is Andrew, and over there is Brandon.
That's me.
You can find us online at namely90s.com or on Twitter and Instagram at namely90s with the 90s. You can also find this show on YouTube every Monday at namely90s.com/YouTube. And finally, if you'd like to support the show, head on over to our Patreon page at patreon.com/namely90s and get signed up for one of the support levels. And well, I guess welcome to our big September special. Doing these monthly specials. And here we are in September. So this time we are happy to welcome a guest. We have guests sometimes.
It's exciting. Yeah. A non-Christmas guest. It's very cool. We get to talk to Andy Frye. I forgot to check if that's the correct pronunciation before we started. So
good start.
Yes,
good company, but no relation.
Fair enough. He's a sports writer, journalist, and now author with his new book, 90 Days in the 90s. Tagline being a rock and roll time travel story, which is very cool and very intriguing and very on brand for us. So welcome to the show.
Thanks.
Yes, welcome.
You guys, and appreciate you having me here virtually with you.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. You've written a book. You've written for Rolling Stone, ESPN. You're currently a sports business writer for Forbes.
Yeah, I'm a contributor. I do about 5 pieces a month, and primarily it's sports business angle. And I get to talk to a lot of famous athletes or retired sports legends. So very little music now, but try to keep it rock and roll nonetheless.
Very cool.
I think most people would suggest that writing for these publications is sort of, the pinnacle of journalism. When I hear something like, oh, he writes for Forbes, I'm like, oh, wow, this guy's actually, he's writing some stuff.
There's a legitimate paywall there.
Totally, yeah.
How many articles can you read? But so what was your journey to writing for these publications? I mean, how did you get here?
Well, it's funny because about a decade ago, I was still working in a cubicle. Writing was always kind of a hobby for me. And I think, generally writing, I think is either you are a writer or you're not. I mean, I think a long time ago, I heard a lot of people coming out of college like, I want to be a writer. And I think what you mean by that is professionally, you want a full-time job. And we're in the middle of the gig economy now where it's not unusual for, PJ O'Rourke. I'm kind of in the middle politically. I'm not too conservative. But I do love some of PJ O'Rourke's books from the 90s because he rips on everybody. And he's a little less pompous now, but he's a contributor like I am, but for the Daily Beast. So, everybody's doing it and it's okay. It's okay to have, I'm much more happy having like four jobs than having one job sitting in a cubicle, smiling and dialing. I was pretty good at sales when I was in it, but, I always had the undercurrent of having a hobby that I thought was, all of our hobbies, I think, are constructive, provided that, you're not hurting anyone. And I was just able to kind of keep with it. And, like in the 90s, we can talk about this. I had a zine when everybody else had a zine, and it got me into some shows for free and got some free CDs and, some cool things that came out of that. And then when everybody got a website, my best friend and I, who was also a writer, same guy who helped me doing the zine, we had a website, like a blog before it was called a blog. And I think I just kept that going. And, back probably in about 2009, when I jumped on Facebook and everyone was kind of mass communicating, and people in my generation, Generation X, were like, oh, wow, I can talk to somebody I haven't seen in 20 years. I don't know if you remember this, but there used to be these things called notes where you do like 10 things about me and my favorite food is, and then you tag a bunch of your friends and annoy the hell out of them, and hopefully they would respond. And I was always doing mine about sports, like, top 5 most embarrassing moments in sports or something like that, and would tag my friends. And I had a couple people, say to me, oh, you write pretty good. Maybe you should, give it a go and try it out. And I think my goal back then, probably between like late 2009, when I first kind of got into it again, and 2011, was like, if I could publish something in the next 5 years, that'd be a huge goal. And I blew through that goal pretty quickly and just kind of kept looking for opportunities, and that's how it unfolded. And, I went from talking to people kind of doing these strange, extreme sports pursuits or something that's off the beaten path, to eventually, getting to interview Johnny Bench and Annika Sorenstam, and someone in the news right now is pretty heavily in the golf news. Greg Norman, got to meet him in person, got to talk to some of my favorites, like Dr. J. I grew up in Philly. I got to talk to him for 20 minutes about basketball, and it's been kind of all over the place. And in the mix, I also writing for ESPN. I got to talk to some what I like to say aging rock stars, talking about tankerings. And it's all been good. And, eventually as a writer, you decide either you have a book in you or you want to see if you can pull off writing a book. And that's really where the book came out of, just sort of all that interviewing and writing experience, and try to make something of it in a different vein.
That's really cool. Yeah, I guess, Andrew, where we went wrong with blogging in the 2000s is we didn't use the notes feature on Facebook.
And I'm not sure we were that good at it, but it was fun. It's okay to not be good at something as long as you're having fun doing it, I suppose.
Oh yeah.
So what led you to the 90s as the theme of this book?
Well, so I love 90s. I mean, I love all kinds of music, but and I try not to be one of those people who, I stopped listening to new music at a certain point. Like, I've got a lot of classic rock fan friends who just they don't go past. Even I think a lot of these guys, it's like, if you had an older brother who's graduated high school in 90, or let's say 84, and I graduated in 1990, all those guys listen to the Eagles, Journey, Springsteen. It would be a far stretch for them to come to a Pearl Jam concert with you, which I think Pearl Jam, they've been around for now. The anniversary of 10's release was last week, and that was 30 years ago. So I try to always be open-minded and listen to new things. And I've just gravitated to the 90s because I think it was sort of, I was in my 20s and I was newly an adult, and I got to, you get to go out and do what you want to do, and you're unleashed from the, the shackles from, being a suburban kid with 2 parents and a, Volvo in the driveway or whatever. You're on your own in the city. But one of the things with the novel is actually I treat the 90s as this golden age, and I think all people in America have it was better back then, and when I was young, everything was great, and you forget about being broke and living in an apartment with 3 or 4 other people, and having one good pair of jeans, and that's it. And so the 90s was, I wanted to play with the music and the scene here. I've always felt, I've lived in Chicago since 1994. I always felt like Chicago was an underrated music city because, maybe it's not live 24/7 like Austin, but we've had our legendary venues and still have some of them still around. We have Metro, and we have the Empty Bottle, and I don't think they're any less important than CBGB New York or Whiskey Go in LA, because there have been bands that Smashing Pumpkins played at Lounge Acts in front of 12 people. And I remember I used to work with a guy who was like, yeah, believe it or not, I was there. Smashing Pumpkins was nobody. My friend dragged me to the show in 1990. And, the band was substantive enough that he remembered, when they finally got big 3 years later. I just wanted to capture all of that and kind of put it in a context of, I can't talk about Chicago when it was in the 70s or 80s, but I can definitely talk about it in the 90s. And also, we can talk about this. There's a lot of things that changed. I was part of the first generation that got emails addresses, and then there's certain dynamics that we kind of take for granted today that were new to us, that I wanted to talk about 90 Days in the 90s, that not for the sake of Pollyanna, but just to kind of depict a different time where things were new and exciting. and the things we take for granted today, whether it's streaming our favorite band or,
Yeah.
picking up a phone when your friend calls you at work to goof around, or an email, capture all that in a situation where you get to meet Darby and kind of hang out with her for, 350 pages or so.
It's such to your point, it's such a transitional time where it's like everything was being invented, where now it seems like everything's kind of been invented. But I think everyone feels that way when they're in the present time. But it's like the last discrete decade. You've got the 70s, you've got the 80s, you've got the 90s. After that, it's just sort of a blur. I'm not sure we're ever going to have a definitive decade where it's like, oh, this is what it was like during this decade. Because, what really was the 2000s through 2010s?
Yeah.
Who knows?
Pop punk.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess that's true. But you know what? You don't get an image in your mind when someone says the 2000s. It just, it doesn't evoke anything.
Well,
really.
we might have like a pre-crazy and a post-crazy Kanye, I think, in pop music.
That's true.
We might, like, my son is 16, and I remember he was like, I don't like this Burma rap. I'm like, you mean mumble rap? And he's like, yeah, like, I know people don't play hi-hat cymbals that fast. I know it's fake. He's a white kid who grew up on the north side of Chicago, so it's different from being from maybe a different community where, like, but we both still have this problem where we think of, like, Drake is from Canada and he was on the Disney Channel. Like, how is that where hip hop is? Is that, we're placing From the Streets from live from Burbank? I don't know. It's just kind of a weird thing to think about. And yeah, there's going to be different ways we will perceive time, maybe not in nicely sliced decades, but yeah, I hope I captured at least a little bit of that.
I like your point about Chicago, because Chicago, like, all that they use Chicago for is the background for medical and cop dramas. It's a little out of control, but the music scene, I like that. That's not something people are hitting a lot of.
Well, you've probably seen High Fidelity. Actually, High Fidelity, the movie, came out in 2000, I believe. I knew a bunch of people were extras in the film. I knew it was going to be here, and I was a fan of Nick Hornby, in part because I really love Fever Pitch, and I would read. I don't read a lot, but I read his books in the 90s, and High Fidelity, the book, takes place in London, and as you know, Hulu did a series just for one season with Zoe Kravitz that takes place in Brooklyn, which is very now. But yeah, I think Chicago is kind of underrated, and the people who know it and love it kind of want to sing its praises. And maybe in the back of my mind, I want to be the Studs Terkel of the 21st century. Who knows? But I feel like there's a lot there that that people can enjoy just hearing about Chicago and a story.
Before we get too far ahead of ourselves, can you give us a brief description of the book?
Yeah, so it's Darby is roughly my age, maybe a little bit younger. She is a Gen X person who she kind of has a moment, like a midlife crisis in a way, in that her career stalls in Wall Street. She splits up with her fiance. Right about the same time, her uncle died. Her favorite uncle dies, and she feels bad that she hasn't kept in touch with her uncle for a while, is just getting busy with life. And she finds out that she inherits his record store right when everything falls apart in New York. So she moves back to Chicago. You kind of start the scene there. And she's living in the apartment above the record store. The record store is like killing it. It's sort of like a mecca. And, she's moving back to Chicago, where she went to college, where she lived for a little while before she just kind of, everything fell apart there, and she absconded to New York. So she's getting back to Chicago, kind of becoming a local again. It kind of reignites her love for music and some nostalgia, of course. And one of the subplot, one of the things that I remember about the 90s, and I mentioned that when we all first got email, was it was sort of the heyday of urban legends. So we all got emails at work. I worked for a company that had like, Euromonitor at AOL.com, and then we all got our individual email addresses, which was huge.
Yeah.
And within about a month, then you're getting emails from friends about, like, hey, there's all these cool things that you didn't know about, and here's some urban legends. And two of the things were, like, one, the Nigerian prince who's exiled who wants to give you $470 million. That popped up eventually. There's also Microsoft is doing a usage test. All you got to do is forward this email to 20 people, and you might get a check for, my cousin got a check for 10 grand from Bill Gates himself. And there's a lot of that. So along the side of that rail, there's this legend about the Gray Line, which is a line of the CTA, the Chicago Transit Authority trains here. That, people say it goes back to the past. It's been bouncing around for a while, and because she's in the thick of being back in Chicago, she starts hearing urban legends about this thing again. Lo and behold, there's a gray line stop under her store, and she has the ability to go back in time and maybe fix some things and maybe correct her life. But I suppose as any one of us Gen Xers who love music would, she goes back to the 90s and gets stuck having a little bit too much of a good time and kind of not dealing with her shit and not dealing with the real reason that she thought she was there. But there's a whole set of adventures that come beyond her re-arrival in 1996 and in the 90s. So yeah, it's time travel fiction with a heavy dose of music and pop culture, 90s, of course. I didn't plan to mention 250, 300 bands. And I don't think I overdo it for people who aren't like alternative rock nut jobs like me. I think people can follow it. Obviously everybody's heard of like Pearl Jam and U2. And I think you can keep pace without being a record store junkie. Mm-hmm. But I guess, like I said before, it gives people the opportunity to kind of tag along with the character and sort of go along with the ride, with them for the ride, and meet some strange people and have some fun times again. And that's really it's very much a dazed and confused approach. I love that movie. It's one of the pinnacle movies in the 90s. And you're just hanging out with the characters for a day. That's what Dazed and Confused is about. And I kind of wanted to see if I could pull that off.
I think you even referenced Dazed and Confused at one point in the book, didn't you?
Oh, yeah, at least one time, maybe.
Yeah.
Times. Yeah, definitely.
I as a somewhat of a music junkie myself, I really enjoyed seeing like, oh, I know that band. I know that band. I don't know that band. I'll have to look them up later. I felt like I was somewhere between Darby and Spacey as the music knowledge of you kind of just exudes into the book. But it's not just your music knowledge that shows up through your writing, also your sports knowledge. There's a lot of for a book about time traveling to kind of go back and relive your youth through music. It's you get a lot of sports references in there too.
If anybody's looking at the video of this, if you guys put it up over my right shoulder is a picture of Michael Jordan hitting the last shot of the 98 finals, basically dusting Brian Russell. And the best part about it is it's, except for Jordan's in color and the rest of the photos in black and white. And so one thing us Bulls fans love to do is kind of look at the faces of the people in the crowd in Utah and just like the utter horror that they experience between him releasing the ball and it dropping into the hoop, because they all know what's coming. And there's this one little kid who's like, yeah, in the background. He's obviously a Bulls fan, but
that's awesome.
There's where we kind of take for granted, I think. I'm a Cubs fan because I've been here for more than half my life, and I'm also like because I grew up in Philly, a lifelong Villanova basketball fan, and I've had a good run of like experience seeing my sports teams do well. And I think that's something a lot of people really love. Like sports could be not that important compared to a lot of stuff going on in the world, but it gives us an opportunity to be part of subculture. And sports subcultures are not any better or worse or less important than music subcultures or, I don't know, Dungeons and Dragons nerds or whatever. I think we all have our things that we drop into. And I can't talk about Chicago in the 90s and not mention Jordan. It's not like I have Darby go to a Bulls game, because you couldn't like the waiting list back then was literally 20 to 30,000 people. You would call and be like, hey, Bulls tickets. All right, we'll call this line, leave your name and number. And they would tell you the waiting list was like 27,000 people just for like nosebleed tickets. And even for a year after Jordan was gone, it was impossible. But then like by 1999, they're calling us like, hey, just try to rally the troops. We need some fans to show up at the game. And the Bulls as an organization are putting out these billboards like with Elton Brand, like through thick and thin, basically like guilt tripping you into not coming to see the Bulls.
That's brilliant.
Well, we've been through a lot of thin being Seattle area fans. I mean, gosh, in our lifetime, we've had one championship in our two, I guess.
Three.
Three?
One
Storm. The Mariners suck. They always have. They always will. It's just one of those things.
We have a chance at the World Series this year.
Oh, geez. Yeah, okay.
We're in the wild card running. I really like, you have a Tribe Called Quest. Is that a placard or something behind you?
Okay, it's like, I don't know what the term is. You have a turntable, which I don't. The felt thing. Turntable protector or something.
The vinyl cover. Yeah, I have one of those, but it's Death Cab for Cutie, and that shows exactly who I am.
I have a fairly vague recollection of anything and everything pop culture, which is weird because I'm the co-host of a pop culture podcast. We don't understand that. It's kind of a joke. But Brandon, being such a music aficionado, knows a lot of these bands and stuff. So I still recognize some for sure, but overall.
So Andrew, when you're home by yourself, Andrew, who do you play air guitar to? I really want to know. And don't
this is interesting because I have a varied and somewhat, it's like varied, but also narrow music taste. I am a big fan of the classic rock. I think that's just because my dad listened to a lot of it growing up, and I wasn't always into like the current music.
Anything I played in my car.
Yeah. Well, the funny thing is Brandon will always have these playlists, and I think the Smashing Pumpkins always played first. And at the time I was like, oh gosh, we're going through Brandon's playlist again. But now it's kind of nostalgic when I hear those songs. Let's see, bands I used to listen to or still do. Jimmy Eat World, which is listed here as one of the bands you interviewed. We saw them live in Seattle. That was pretty good.
Yeah, one of our first concerts.
Really big fan of Bad Religion.
All right, they're coming to the Riot Fest. I'm going to see them in 2 weeks. And
they're so good.
I want to see 7 Seconds and a bunch of other bands, but I've never seen Bad Religion. They're tight. So I
appreciate their lyrics are well written and it's a great band. I love them a lot. So I just missed them in concert. The worst thing is when you find out that they were in town 3 days ago and you had no idea. Any band that you would want to see. It's like and I live in a town where they don't come here much, unfortunately. So yeah. But
it was like the Shins just played Big Sur, and I'm like an hour and a half away from that, and I learned about it like 2 days after, and I was so devastated because Henry Miller Library is a really cool venue to watch the Northwest 2000, like late 90s 2000 bands from.
I guess it is a dynamic of age. So I've got a friend that I went to see Built to Spill with. So my son, I guess it must have been 2 weeks ago. Yeah, maybe it was 2 weeks ago. He's like, Dad, I'm going to the Built to Spill show with my friend and his dad. I was like, oh, cool, awesome. Like, I don't really like the band, but I remember when my friend Tim, he's like, you want to go? I'm like, yeah, sure. Like, I don't really like them, but because I actually saw them at Lounge X in 1997. So I go to meet him there. And I want to say they had 2 shows. Like, Tim always does this. Like, we're going to see the Replacements together, and he was there last night too. And I'm like, okay, where are you? I'm up front. So I'm like, okay, clock, or are you at 11 o'clock? You at 1? Because that actually works at busy concerts. So I got like 4 beers in my hand. I'm going to find him. And I get up there. He's like, yeah, I was here last night. And I was like, oh, you need to see him again? Like, they're that good? Fine, whatever. But so 2 weeks ago, I literally dropping off my kid at his friend's house because they're going to go down to Thalia Hall. And I was like, are you going to Built to Spill? Or maybe it was the next day. I was like, did you go to Built to Spill last night? I was like, no, I didn't even know they were in town. I'm like, really? You're kind of off your game, Tim, because I would have thought you would have been, this is a guy who will go to Lounge X, not Lounge X. Empty Bottle is this venue in Chicago where sometimes they have these shows where you show up, and if you're one of the first 200 people in line, you get to go to the show. So he calls me one time several years ago. He's like, do you want to go see Japandroid tonight?
Well,
like, yeah, sure, I guess. And he's like, I'm like, get me an extra ticket. And he's like, well, no, I'm in line now. And I said, well, I guess I'm not going to be able to make it in then unless you want me to cut, or we pay everybody behind you in line to let me in. Because, so
there would be riots.
Like my super uber hip friends who are always like on the beat of what's coming next are starting to lose their game. And I guess that means we're all getting old now. So there's no shame in that. We all have shit to do. It's just, you can only keep up with so much.
So before we get to the book, where can people find you? Where can people find the book? We'll cover this again, but
my website is andyfrye.com, Frye with an E. There's actually right on the front page, it will take you to 90daysin90s.com, which is where you can buy the book. But 90s in the 90s.com. So if you want like a signed copy and some swag, do it that way. If you are, connected at the hip to Amazon, you can obviously buy it at Amazon.com and pretty much anywhere you want to get books, pretty much around the world. If you're outside the US, I think you have to get it from Amazon because it would cost me like $40 to ship it to you.
That's not economical. No, that's not going to work.
That's awesome. I wanted to touch on, you touched on it a little bit already, setting the book in Chicago, because that's where you spent the 90s. But what was it like putting yourself in that mind space of going back to 1996 Chicago? Like you have a deep knowledge of the venues, which is really cool, and it really shows as it adds extra flavor to the narrative. And what can you tell us? Just like what was it mapping? What was it like trying to like? Because I go home to Seattle all the time, and I'm like, oh, I remember this over here being different, and I remember when that first Albertsons went in right there. But it's like, what was it like going back 3 decades at this point to 96?
Well, I started writing this about 5 years ago. So it was 5 years ago, June 1st. I got an idea over Easter, and I thought, well, this is really cool. And I think what some writers do is we set ideas aside, and if we care about it like 2-3 weeks later, just the same, and the bar napkin wasn't thrown away, then we jump back into it, give it a try. So I think like I just thought about it. Maybe I have a different point of view about time travel. Like I always think about what would I want to experience, like that sandwich shop that I used to love that shut down, or that place with the $2 Guinness that also served tacos. Like I would want to go there. There's a lot of that kind of stuff in the 90s. I remember I was visiting a friend in Minneapolis. He took me to this bar called Chang O'Malley's, which was, the story was, I think it was a guy who was married to he's Irish guy who married to a woman whose last name is Chang. And they would serve it was like an Irish pub that served Chinese food. I don't know if it's still around. It's like that stuff, or like Suns Eat Malone's in Cincinnati, where you could go see a band and wash your clothes. Like that was rife. And I thought about those kind of things, not like, well, if I go back through time, would I save the world? Would I prevent 9/11? Would I prevent, the SNL scandal or whatever to save the economy? Like I never really thought in those broad brushes, like, oh, I need to make sure that Princess Diana doesn't get in that car that night. I just wanted to go experience things. So it wasn't really that hard for me to think about. And I'm not like, I'm happy with where I am in life. I'm not a person who think, I wish I could go back to high school and wish I could go back to the good old times. Just the same. If you could jump back in time, I would just want to hang out for a week and just see. I'd probably spend a day or two doing nothing, walking around to see what was still there. And then I would get up the nerve to like go to a concert, go to my favorite bar and walk in. And I wanted it also to be independent of dropping in on, my grandfather or something like that. But there's those dynamics I think happen in time travel literature. I really just wanted to go and kind of experience the things. And I thought about concerts that I've been to, shows I've been to, where they were, what it was like, what it smelled like, what I drank. I probably was rubbing 2 nickels together and could only afford the 25-cent Huber beers that they used to have on certain nights at the Empty Bottle. I'm not sure what the cheapest brew they have there now, but like you could subsist on quarter beers at certain places to see a DJ or a band that you wanted to witness, and that was kind of a lifestyle. So I wanted to jump back into that. It wasn't really that hard to think that way. Maybe it's I haven't grown up and I want to just kind of do that again. But yeah, it was easier than I thought. And then the difficult part about writing a novel is, well, how do I come up with 70,000 to 100,000 words to make something of this? And then what do I do with these characters that I want to create? And that kind of all evolves if you stick with it. And I got to a point where I created major characters and minor characters, and they had their quirks and the music that they liked, and the bands, the terrible bands, maybe that they would be embarrassed to tell you that they liked. And I just kind of wanted to hang out with them for a while. And that's really what it became about. I just followed that momentum and revised a billion times and hired an editor, and just kind of came to fruition when it was ready to be put out.
What was it? I mean, because you're writing a period piece, it's funny that the 90s, you can say that. It must have been difficult. Sometimes you're about to write that they pulled out their cell phone and texted somebody, and you're like, oh, hold on. No, they walked to the phone booth and picked up the phone book and dialed. I just imagine that at some time probably caused some issues.
Yeah, if you read, sounds like Brandon spun through the book, there's a couple times where Darby makes these anachronisms where she'll mention something that hasn't happened yet. I think in the first chapter, one of the first chapters where she ends up at Lounge Action, she's talking to this girl named Rachel that she is smitten with. And Rachel is kind of like, imagine Jessica Chastain in a leather jacket. Like she's She's like a pretty redhead who's a metalhead, and she's not ashamed of it. And Darby's kind of become a music snob again. So then she mentioned something like Darby's from New Jersey originally, even though she went to college and stayed in Chicago. And she mentioned she's from New Jersey, and Rachel's kind of picking on her. And it's like, oh, you like Bon Jovi? And she's like, oh, I can't believe that I hate Bon Jovi. I can't believe that they made it to the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Mm. Even though this is back in '96, they're not in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. I think that happened in like 2014, which I still don't know how that happened. But she's mentions that, and Rachel's like, what are you talking about? They're not in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And she has to kind of stop herself a couple times mentioning these things that happened in the later '90s or in the 2000s or whatever.
That's funny.
So wanted to play with that. I took improv comedy for many years and performed at Second City a little bit. And that's very cool. Chicago. Mm-hmm. And one thing that you learn in comedy is like do something 3 times if it's funny. The thing about the Seinfeld episode, the Junior Mints or the Snickers bar comes up 3 times, maybe 4.
Comedy comes in 3s.
I don't know why that works. It just works. So I played with that with the technology and other things.
That's funny. That actually parallels. I just watched, I'm late to the party on a lot of movies. I just watched that movie yesterday. Are you familiar? Mm-hmm. And it was a similar thing where he kept referencing things that that didn't exist, and people were there you go. People were confused. I love that. That was kind of one of my favorite parts of that movie. So when I do get around to reading the book, I will look for that.
Yesterday, one thing I did do is I kind of didn't allow myself to watch certain movies. I remember I was at a writing conference probably back in 2019 and just met somebody who was asking me what my book was about. And they're like, oh, it's like that Woody Allen movie, Midnight in Paris. And I think, well, kind of. I hadn't seen that since it came out. And I sort of barred myself from seeing Hot Tub Time Machine. And when yesterday came out, I was a little bit tepid. I wanted to finish up. But
I mean, there will be overlaps because it's a time travel story. There's going to be common themes. You can't really get away from that.
Yeah, and it's just the same. And yesterday, I can't remember the character's name, but he doesn't feel it's upon himself to save the world. He kind of falls into this thing being a diehard Beatles fan. He's not going to go an hour without mentioning the Beatles. And then he's basically, is their story in this time space continuum where they don't exist and nobody has heard of them. But I did see that movie after I completed probably the 8th draft. And there's a scene where Darby hears about the Gray Line because she wants to see, is this for real? Or I'm up late. I don't have anything to do. I'm going to jump on the internet. And I was kind of thinking, how do you do that in a book? Is it boring for you and me to read about someone searching on the internet? And then when I saw yesterday, I think the first thing that the character does when he realizes people don't know who the Beatles are is he goes to the internet and searches it, and Wikipedia shows a beetle, a
yeah.
So I kind of validated what I was doing. I needed to kind of make that chapter kind of short and sweet and to the point. But that's, I think, something that any of us would do if we found out tomorrow that, I don't know, if I found out I'm living in, this part of Northern Illinois and it's not called Chicago and nobody knows what I'm talking about. Whether it's Chicago, I would Google Chicago and see if it came up on the internet to see if I'm crazy or not. That's the way we validate facts these days. So
yeah, and that's a good point. You also, I think there's a scene on the bus with the kids, the preppy girl with the cell phone versus the kind of goth girls on the bus. That kind of looks into how back then it's a commentary on how back then we didn't have these devices that can.
You had a calling card you could use at the phone booth,
Yeah.
That actually did happen. I just don't mean to interject, but my roommate actually was I think we both had 2 jobs in 1996 or 97. And we still couldn't afford cell phones because it wasn't something everybody had. But he comes to me and tells me the story, there's a punk chick and two goth girls, and they're kind of having this sort of drama as to whether or not it's punk or not punk to have a cell phone. It wouldn't even occur to you now. You would never see I wouldn't be surprised if I heard about the band Fugazi that Ian MacKaye doesn't have a cell phone because he's just he's straight edge vegan purist, doesn't eat, isn't into marketing his band and
doesn't need those EM waves near him.
Yeah, I wouldn't think that someone would be like, well, I don't own a cell phone because it's not punk and I'm a punk. But that was actually a thing in the 90s. It was a big moral dilemma. I wanted to kind of play with that both because it kind of happened to a friend of mine, but then also it's relevant and also ridiculous that we've had, it's kind of like making fun of Gen X. We were overly hung up on authenticity. For much as we want to bag millennials or Gen Z about their taste in music or what their thing is, or I often make fun of millennials for being like, hey, you want to go out and get a beer? Is that on fleek? I'll kind of joke about some of the hashtags and stuff.
It's pretty bad. I mean, I think we're getting close to geriatric millennial. I'm not quite sure. I think we're middle-aged millennials, but no, it's pretty bad. Honestly.
Gen X, we were overly consumed with authenticity about like, oh, is this pencil like authentic wood or is it, fake? Like, is it vintage enough for me to use? Like, well, I'll make fun of Gen Xers too, but anyway.
I feel like millennials are like that, but with mustaches that are styled.
It's that and pronouncing things correctly in acronyms. Is an acronym, do you read it as the word or do you pronounce each letter? Because I've noticed that's been so you said you've been writing the book for about 5 years, but the present story is, or the portion of the story that's set in the present is post-COVID. Can you talk a little bit about like how is it writing a book that's happened after this traumatic thing that we've all been through for the last two years?
I started writing this thing in June of 2017, and then we all went through it. And probably like 2019 and 2020, when I thought this book was done and ready to be published, it wasn't really ready. Mm-hmm. So I worked on it a lot more, and it just ended up being better, I think, and I was more happy with the end of it. But it kind of worked out that, it got published in 2022, kind of as we're emerging from COVID. I was hoping that we weren't going to go back into COVID with another variant, but I wanted to kind of deal with that because, so I'm 50. One of the things I'm doing, like I've got next weekend, I'm going to see Echo and the Bunnymen.
Nice.
Week after that, I'm going to see Mama, which is a band from California. They're probably like 20 years old. They're pretty young. They sound like Veruca Salt and Local H, to me, both great Chicago bands. So when I found out they're playing Sleeping Village for like $13, I'm like, I'm going. I think I bought my tickets in like April. It's been a while. I'm going to see L7 for the third time. So that's what, Gen Xers who, like my kid's old enough to stay home and he doesn't need a babysitter. We have a little bit of money and enough to buy, concert tickets. That's like what we're doing. So if I'm talking about the authentic audience that Darby is part of, that's what we would be doing. But I also have friends who have not been to a restaurant in 2.5 years and just like, I want to say, let's go out. Let's get a bite. No, I don't do restaurants yet because of COVID, or they might sit outside. So there's some of that. It wasn't that difficult to navigate. I probably changed that first chapter a couple times just based on where we were. But I wanted to, I guess, ideally, I didn't even know that this was happening as a wish listing. I kind of want to be like, okay, we're back again, trying to experience life. What is that like? And there's maybe a parallel to Darby going back to the 90s to experience what that was about. Just take it all in, both in the present and the past. So there's a little bit of symmetry that just kind of worked out there. But I didn't really belabor too much. Like I wanted to like, do people she knows, like you don't really know why Uncle Martin, who on the record store died, other than that he was pretty old.
That's a good point.
A senior citizen of some sort. I kind of played with the idea, like, did he die of COVID suddenly? Or like, I think my editor that I was working with was just like, well, that could be a big risk, or maybe you don't have to make that decision, just like you're not making the decisions that Darby has to save the world just because she's going back in time. So, I did pretty well in the pandemic. Wrote a lot, listened to a lot of music. I mean, I didn't get sick. I'm thankful for that. I remember my 40th birthday. No, sorry, no, wasn't my 40th. No, my anyway, I'm forgetting what age I am. I had a birthday. I guess it was just like my birthday in April 2020, and friends were like, "Are you okay? Like, you can't come out and celebrate your birthday." And I just would say, like, I'm happy that I'm not waking up with a splitting headache and inability to breathe this morning. So I just took it all in as an opportunity to kind of, as Gwyneth Paltrow would say during the pandemic, like, learn a language or write a novel or, I don't know, invent some strange, home remedy to sell.
Learn a TikTok dance.
People. Yeah. Yeah, it wasn't so. To answer your question on COVID, I kind of used it a little bit. I didn't ignore it because you couldn't ignore it. If you're writing a book that took place in the fall of 2001, you wouldn't ignore that 9/11 happened. Right. I don't watch a lot of TV, but I watched every episode of Mad Men. I'm a huge soccer fan, and I remember when Lane, the English character, mentions in the meeting, like the Monday morning meeting, like, hey, not sure if you're aware, England won the World Cup, so I know this is taking place in 1966. They didn't ignore that. So I think sometimes you acknowledge things, you don't ignore it. You don't necessarily have to master the world events in your novel, but you unless you're in an alternative reality like a Neil Gaiman novel, or maybe the movie yesterday. You have to kind of acknowledge what's going on around you and not ignore it. And that's all you have to do, I think.
And meanwhile, in 1996, everyone has COVID because she accidentally brought. No, I'm just kidding.
That would be a terrible, terrible sequel. I didn't even think about that. Holy shit.
She wore a mask on the Gray Line. It's fine.
Well, I mean, that's the great thing about time travel stories is that as long as it's working within your set rules, you could leave other stuff ambiguous, like how did she not spread COVID to everyone,
or how did she pay for things? That was always my question. It's like, is her bank card still working? No, it's
well, she. I don't want to.
You can buy cheap beer.
Yeah, she found a.
I thank you for addressing that because I feel like a lot of people don't address that kind of thing.
Whereas I stayed up and finished it last night. So
so there was a scene where I removed it because the editor was like, I know that because I was in the financial services world for a while, and I have a whole sub part where I don't know, it was like the $600 she puts in her pocket is now, I actually use the inflation calculator. It was like $412.
I love that.
Like, dude, what the fuck? But it was just a little bit too like, okay, this is great that you're doing it, is what Grace, my editor, said. But she's like, it's great, but you need to stick to the plot. You got to keep the plot going. So it's great that you think this is cool and this is important to the time travel. Maybe in the movie version that would happen. But if you're doing a whole 3 pages about currency exchanges and negative inflation working from 2022 to 1996, you're going to lose some people. Or, at the time I was querying it to agents and she's like, you're definitely going to lose them. So unless you feel like you really need this, pull it out. And I did. But it was there's a lot of exercises like that helped me craft the book that I ended up taking that part out. But yeah, I did think about those things, believe it or not.
I wanted to ask one big question, one more question before we hit break. That's related to time travel and writing about time travel is that you can structure your book differently than you would a single narrative that goes forward in time. You have midway through I think you called it a prequel to the book in the middle of the book, which I thought was very, very cool. But you kind of get some backstory filled in about Darby before this era of her life that she goes back to. And then within that, you do a flashback to even before that. And I just, did you find it more freeing or kind of more tedious that you had a malleable timeline to play with when you were writing Darby's story?
Yeah, I think I wanted originally, a couple drafts in, I had her going back to her 90s, kind of earlier in the 90s episode where she's hanging out with her friends in Europe. And that was kind of a 90s thing too, a lot of funny scenes. But I guess it wasn't really, I don't like to use the word struggle because I didn't feel like it was a struggle, but it was work to kind of connect that. So one question that maybe popped up is Darby goes back in time from 2022 to 1996. Some things don't go away in the beginning, but most of it does. And at some point she's got her old job back that she loved as a music writer. She's dating this bombshell, Rachel, who likes music and hang out with her friends again. And she has to address the question, why did I ever leave this? And she knows that she left because before she met Rachel and before all this great stuff happened, she had left because she broke up with somebody, her job wasn't going anywhere. Her best friend absconded in Europe, which is sort of why you have this prequel that you get the reasons for, what happened before all this and what made her just make the split decision to move to New York if all this stuff was great. There's got to be, you can't blag your way through that. So you get to experience her, in 1994 and some times before this, which is why I call it a prequel. And, she does a lot of things that 20-somethings in their, people in their 20-something in a big city would do. And, it's you get to, again, tag along with her, but also see some of the life episodes that maybe precipitated decisions that maybe were or were not the right decision that made her do what she did before she, because I think it is relevant. If you go back in time and everything's perfect, well, is it perfect? And let's talk about that. It can't just be she goes back in time and everything's honky-dory and she lives happily ever after. That, she has to kind of get real with the fact that she made some mistakes and that she also did have a reason to leave. That's why she left to go to New York to try to be this Wall Street hotshot for a while and, get a real job and get a real career when she didn't think the music writing thing was going the way it should have or the way she wanted it to. And you also get some insight on the characters and sort of, why they are the way they are. And so I felt like originally it was just, here's some cool stuff that happened, back before Luke Skywalker became a Jedi, kind of approach. But also I wanted it to be some rationale and really some validating of, or maybe not validating, explaining why she did some of the things that she did that you were presented with on page one of the novel. So I felt like it was a good thing for me to do, and it just sort of tied everything together.
I think it really worked well for the story. Just kind of because in the beginning you're wondering, I guess if I went back to this point in time, there would have to be something that there would be a reason why she picked that date, and relative to your time travel rules and mechanics. But it definitely, I liked how it unwrapped more about her and all of the people that surrounded her. Very, very, very well done. Andrew, do you want to take us to?
Yeah. All right, let's go to Brandon for the Namely 90s Minute.
Welcome back to our mid-episode break, Namely 90s Minute. Every week we look back at a culturally relevant show, movie, or piece of pop culture that probably helps stoke the algorithm. This week, in honor of 90 Days in the 90s, we're looking back at a movie that involves both time travel and music. Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey. Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey is a 1991 sequel to the cult classic time travel adventure Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. It stars Neo from The Matrix as Ted, Marco from The Lost Boys as Bill, and the legendary comedian Cardinal Glick from Dogma as Rufus. It also features Haywood from The Shawshank Redemption as Death. The story starts in the far future where Bill and Ted's band, the Wild Stallions, have helped create a utopian society, but a former gym teacher turned terrorist named Chuck Dinomulos steals a time-traveling phone booth and sends evil Bill and Ted robots back in time to ruin their life and stop the pivotal moment in history when they won the San Dimas Battle of the Bands. Rufus tries to stop it from happening, but gets lost in the circuits of time. In the present, Bill and Ted audition for the Battle of the Bands with their girlfriends. Somehow, Bill and Ted are still not good enough at playing music, yet they're destined to win, but they make it in the show anyway. After a party, Bill and Ted propose to their girlfriends right as the evil robots arrive from the future. The robots lure them out to Vasquez Rocks and throw the original pair over a cliff, killing them, and proceed to ruin their lives. In the afterlife, Bill and Ted meet Death and give him a wedgie to escape. They call it a Melvin. Then they try to contact their friends via possession and eventually try speaking via seance, but it results in them being sent to hell where they meet Satan, who tortures them. Bill and Ted decide to face Death and play a game for their souls, and much to Death's dismay, they pick modern games like Battleship, Clue, and Twister and beat him easily, leaving him at their command. Bill and Ted look to the smartest person in the universe to help build robots to beat their evil robot duplicates, so they enlist the help of God, who sends them to an alien duo named Station that helps them while they get resurrected on Earth. At the Battle of the Bands, the good robots beat the bad robots, but then Dinomulos shows up in a time booth and attempts to kill Bill and Ted again. Bill and Ted then reason they can go back in time after this encounter to set things up to capture Dinomulos here in the present, but he then plans on doing the same to stop them, so then they say only the winner of the Battle of the Bands can use the time booth. So instead, Dinomulos gets Melvin by the death and is arrested. Rufus then reveals that he was the woman event organizer of the Battle of the Bands all along, but as Bill and Ted are about to play, they realize they still suck, so they use the time booth to do 16 months of guitar training and a 2-week honeymoon. And because of time travel, they then take the stage and play the most epic concert in history, which unites the world, and oh my god, how did all of this fit into a 93-minute movie that people actually watched? And that's Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey in a Namely 90s Minute, more or less.
And now back to the show.
All right. We're here with Andy Frye, and I wanted to take a quick break from talking about 90 Days in the 90s to do a quick game that I like to call 1996. Do you remember it better than a 7-year-old? Because Andrew would have been
7-ish, 8-ish. Yeah.
So I have 10 questions. They're multiple choice. We're going to put Andy up against Andrew.
Oh, no.
And as regular listeners know, Andrew's definitely going to lose this one.
Yes, absolutely.
But I've picked some random stuff that happened in 1996. And although if Andrew had actually paid attention to our last 120 episodes, he would be able to at least tie you on.
I'll do better today than I would have before we started the podcast, but I'm still not going to do well. But we'll give it a shot.
So we're going to start with music, since that's a big part of the book. Which song spent longer at number one on the Billboard Hot 100 in 1996? Was it One Sweet Day by Mariah Carey and Boyz II Men, or The Macarena Bayside Boys Mix by Los Del Rio? And I guess we'll go with Andrew first, because I have a feeling Andy knows the correct answer.
I want to say the Macarena. I feel like that thing was on the charts for an eternity.
Andrew's locking in the Macarena, and Andy.
It's weird, because I remember watching, and I think I might have mentioned this in the book. I mentioned the presidential conventions. I actually didn't mention them. I remember watching the Republican convention. I'm having flashbacks there because I was stoned out of my gourd, and we're watching like these uptight people from Kansas and Mississippi, these, doing the Macarena on Thursday night on the Republican convention on national TV. I'm like, geez, whoa, this is whack, man. But it's funny. But I feel like the Macarena had kind of a gradual late swell that took a while. So I'm going to go with the Mariah Carey tune, just because I think I'm surprised. I like to watch MTV Classic a lot, and I watch the 90s Nation, and I'm surprised how much Mariah Carey is on there. Again, really? Like, she was just on 20 minutes ago, and so that's what kind of pushed me towards saying Mariah Carey and Boyz II Men, who are freaking huge.
Oh yeah.
So.
All right. So for this one, Andrew is actually correct. In 1996, the Macarena held 14 weeks at number one, whereas One Sweet Day was 11 weeks. But Andy would have been right for total time at the number one, because they were 5 weeks in 1995 leading into 96, where they were also, or One Sweet Day was also at number one. So sorry for being tricky.
Well, at least he's not asking you which decade various McDonald's were built in, which is one of the games I had to play with Brandon. It was not fun.
I enjoyed it. All right, so Andrew's up by one. This is the only lead that he will have in this game. Next up, what I like video games. Video games were a big part of my 90s experience, and in 1996, I was curious, what was the best-selling video game console of 1996 worldwide? Was it the Nintendo 64, the Nintendo Game Boy, the Sony PlayStation, or the Sega Genesis?
So the Dreamcast wasn't around then. Okay.
Dreamcast came out in 98, I believe. Nintendo 64 released this year in 96 in Japan, and later in the year in the US. Game Boy had been around the whole time. PlayStation was released in 95, I believe. And Genesis was 94. Andy, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I'm going to say there's a commonality between the Genesis and Phil Collins. It can't be that. Although Phil Collins had some number one.
I love Phil Collins.
So I don't know. I don't remember the Genesis, but I feel like I remember there's a certain period of time where my younger brother, was maybe a preteen at the time, wanted the Game Boy. So I'm going to say, I don't remember when the Game Boy was released, but I'm going to say that was its first big year when it was a must-have Christmas present. So I'm going to say Game Boy.
Okay.
I'm kind of vacillating between the Nintendo 64 and Sony PlayStation. I mean, it was PlayStation or Sony's first real foray into the market, which could have caused a lot of buzz and interest, but Nintendo was the more recognized name. I'm going to go with PlayStation.
Oh, okay. Answer's locked in. Andrew, I don't know how you're doing so well. This has never happened before. The Sony PlayStation sold 6.6 million units. The Game Boy sold 4 million, and the Genesis sold 4 million, and the 64 sold 2.8 million.
Oh, only? Wow, I'm surprised by that.
Well, because it didn't release. It released in Japan, and then it was kind of sold out. So Andrew with 2 points, Andy skunking right now, but I have one that neither of you will get.
I have a 1 in 4 chance of getting the next one.
You have a 1 in
right.
4 chance in this one. I am also kind of a comic book nerd.
No.
And I constantly try to insert some comic book classics into our 90s podcast. What famous 90s comic book event / story started in 1996? Was it Batman The Long Halloween, which was a mysterious killer named Holiday who keeps murdering people on holidays? And it was a year-long story that was actually really, really good. Was it The Death of Superman, that iconic shot of Doomsday and Superman killed each other and his torn cape on the cover? Was it the Spider-Man clone saga, where it's a mess, but people loved it? Peter Parker was apparently cloned in the 70s, and then he thought his clone died, but he was the clone, but he actually wasn't, because it was a
didn't we not really even know about DNA in the 70s? I'm just going to point that out. But
is that how we ended up with Tobey Maguire playing Spider-Man, because the clones are so terrible they had to find him?
Yes, pretty much. And then he did the little emo dance in number 3, and just
they had barely discovered DNA. I'm still curious how the cloning is happening.
And then well, I think it was just like they Xeroxed him.
Okay, fair enough.
In the comics. And then finally is Batman gets his back broken in the Nightfall arc, that another famous Bane breaking Batman's back over his knee.
Batman's back. Wow.
So we have The Long Halloween, Death of Superman, Spider-Man Clone Saga, or Nightfall. Andrew, you're up first again.
I'll go Spider-Man. I really have no earthly idea.
I know, this one was just for me. Andy, do you have a guess?
I was going to say the Clone Saga, because they're Dolly, the clone.
Oh, the sheep, yeah.
But I want to say that was probably 95. So I'm going to say the Nightfall Batman one, because I don't know jack about comics.
Okay.
Same.
It was actually Batman The Long Halloween. So sorry to both of you, but I just wanted to say all those things and get it into our podcast, because I never got the chance. All right. 1996 is a marvelous year for Marvel actresses. Which one was not born in 1996? We have Zendaya, who played MJ in the Spider-Man number 3. Andrew likes to number the Spider-Man actors by their films. Spider-Man number 3 films. We have Florence Pugh, who played Yelena Belova, the younger sister of Black Widow. Haley Steinfeld, who plays Kate Bishop, the new Hawkeye from the Hawkeye Disney Plus series. Or Letitia Wright, she plays Shuri, the younger sister of the Black Panther. So which one of those actresses was not born in 1996?
I'll say Letitia Wright, because I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know why, but I just have this general sense that it's Haley Steinfeld.
Okay. Andrew went with Haley Steinfeld. Andy went with Letitia Wright. Andy is correct. Bringing his point total to 1. Andrew somehow still has 2 points. Moving on. What was the highest grossing film of 1996? Was it Twister? Was it Mission Impossible? Was it Independence Day? Or was it the sports classic Space Jam? Andrew, I think you go first.
Oh, I really shouldn't get this wrong. That they're all really close together. I'm going to go with Independence Day.
Okay. Andrew has Independence Day. How about you, Andy?
Yeah, I'm going to go with the steaming pile of horse dung that was, Bill Pullman's great acting relation. ID4 is ID4 they branded it, which kind of doesn't really make sense. They call it ID4. It's kind of redundant.
No. Yeah, I've always wondered about that. You were both correct.
Twister was a huge success. I was surprised by that too, because it's just like, oh, there's another tornado. We're going to call it Twister. We'll chase it, and Philip Seymour Hoffman's like, yeah, dude.
Yeah, that character was too much, but that is the first movie that was released on DVD. We learned. I actually just watched it recently. I'm a big Michael Crichton fan, and so I'm catching up on some of the stuff that's sort of, he wrote the screenplay, but I do think the acting is a little over the top.
I had it on VHS,
and I just saw we started watching Sleepless in Seattle last night, where Bill Pullman is the most unlikable character ever.
Sounds about right.
He was on SNL. The one time he was on SNL, probably in '96. I'm pretty sure he was drunk. And I remember years ago hearing Sean Penn being interviewed by Terry Gross on NPR, and he's drunk, and he's just like, yeah, I'm drunk, and alcohol's helped me be who I am. Like basically doing Sean Penn, competent, drunk, believable, and Bill Pullman, you're like, man, really? You had to be drunk for this? It was more boring as a
I thought Bill Pullman was dead. turns out his character died in The Equalizer 2, but he's actually alive and well. Who knew?
I see. That's the same thing
Bill
they thought
Paxton,
about.
Bill Pullman. I get him confused sometimes too.
Yeah, Pullman's like David Caruso without the red hair. They're career life support. Anyway, Independence Day is what I'm going to say. I think we both probably.
You're both correct.
Yeah.
The park. It was 817,000 grossed in the box office. Twister, I believe, was second with about half as much, followed by Mission Impossible, and Space Jam came in at number 10. Surprisingly,
not surprisingly.
I remember one of the British magazines. I used to pick up Melody Maker all the time, and the Face. And I remember they reviewed Mission Impossible as Mission Unwatchable, and I thought it was Mission Impossible. They thought that is Independence Day, but who knows?
That's right up Andrew's alley with the pun there.
Yes, absolutely.
Next question. 1996 brought us the U.S. movie / backdoor. Another nerd thing. You guys are going to hate this one. U.S. movie / backdoor pilot TV movie, of a Doctor Who reboot on Fox that didn't happen. It featured Paul McGann as the Doctor. What number incarnation of Doctor Who was he? Was he number 7, number 8, number 9, or number 5? I think, Andy, you have honors.
Well, definitely not 5 because there were half a dozen before I got out of high school. So I'm going to say halfway between 8 or 9. I guess I'll just say 8.
All right. And Andrew, you love the British
I'm feeling
sci-fi.
7. I don't know why. I'm just feeling 7.
Okay. And with that, Andy evens up the score.
Okay.
It was the 8th Doctor, Paul McGann, who reprised his role 20-ish years later in a 5-minute episode before the 50th anniversary episode. All right, so you're both tied at 3.
I actually watched a little bit of the Chris Eccleston one, which must have been like 9 or 10. But mainly because 90s reference, Billy Piper was his sidekick there.
Oh, yeah. Billy Piper. All right. That was 6 questions in. We have 4 left. Andrew has plenty of time to lose this tie. So not everything is happy in 1996. Which power couple didn't get a... But, oh, wait. I didn't set up this question well. There were a lot of divorces. Which power couple didn't get a divorce in 1996? Was it Michael Jackson and Lisa Marie Presley? Was it Prince Charles and Princess Di? Was it Nelson and Winnie Mandela? Or was it Pamela Anderson and Tommy Lee? Which couple didn't get a divorce in 1996? Andrew, you are up.
Wow. This is going to have to be a total guess because I don't have a recollection of this. We'll go with Pam and Tommy.
Okay, Andrew's locking in Pam and Tommy. How about you, Andy?
I'm going to go with Winnie and Nelson because I think that one of my favorite movies is Invictus, where is it Morgan Freeman plays Mandela?
That would make sense.
Mm-hmm.
And so that takes place during the Rugby World Cup of 1995. I think somebody, like there's a scene where one of the like Secret Service guys mention his wife, and he gets sad and decides not to take his 5 a.m. morning walk. So I think, I mean, I don't know when technically the divorce was, but I think just going back to that scene, I'll probably say it happened before 1996.
All right. Great recollection, but they did finalize their divorce in 96. But Pamela Anderson, Tommy Lee finalized theirs in 95.
Ooh.
Which we brought up in an episode like a month ago, Andrew. So I'm impressed that you kind of remember.
Yeah, I didn't.
Something.
It was subconscious, if anything.
Yeah. So Andrew takes the lead again.
Were they remarried or no? Were they remarried or just hanging out again together?
I think they were just hanging out again. Yeah. The 95 divorce was after she filed the battery charges. All right. Coming back into Andy's wheelhouse now, we have a section called Sports Go Sports. But this one might be more Andrew's. Who knows? Because Andrew's a hockey buff. He's an undercover hockey buff. Who won the Stanley Cup in 1996? Was it the Colorado Avalanche, the Florida Panthers, the Detroit Red Wings, or the New Jersey Devils? Andy, I think it's your
the Flyers. So you said the Devils, the Avalanche, the Red Wings, or who else?
Florida Panthers.
If I remember right, because I grew up a Flyers fan, I may be off in the year. I want to say that the Flyers got swept by the Detroit Red Wings, got their asses handed to them, and so I'm going to go with the Red Wings.
Ooh.
All right.
Well, Colorado and New Jersey were, I believe, really good at this time. I think Colorado won it in 95. Did they? I'm going to go with Colorado.
All right. Andrew, you are correct on this one. I was looking, it's either 95 or 97 that the Flyers got swept by the Red Wings.
Good memory there, though.
Yeah, dude, I'm sorry to be like super nitpicky. But Andrew, you pull ahead to 5-3.
This is odd. This is uncharted territory.
I wasn't expecting him to do this. I
just got my AARP card. Just so you know.
That's fair enough. We have another Sports Go Sports. Who won the 1996 NBA Finals? Was it the Seattle SuperSonics or the Chicago Bulls? And I will give you a bonus point if you can tell me who the MVP was. Andrew, you're first.
Wow, this is going to be embarrassing.
Because it was the one that we should have watched. And no.
I don't. I'm not a basketball fan. Well, I have to say Chicago. I mean.
Okay. And do you have a guess for the MVP?
Michael Jordan, I guess. I don't know.
All right. And Andy?
So the Jordan's Bulls, who won 91, 92, 93, 96, 97, and 98, won the 1996 finals on Father's Day. And I guess I would have to say that Jordan was the MVP because I can't think of anybody else.
Someone usurps him on that.
Yeah.
That is correct. Can either of you tell me, Andrew, you first, for another bonus point, how many times was this that Jordan won MVP in the NBA Finals?
At this time, it sounds like 4. Because he just explained all the times that he won.
I was trying to get Andy an extra point here. Okay. Yeah. All right.
Did the Supersonics ever win after the 70s? I don't think that they did.
I don't know.
That was like Seattle championship. This doesn't compute.
All right. Just for the stakes, we'll make this last one worth 2. The one after the Super Bowl, which is a Friends episode that aired after the Super Bowl in 1996, is an episode where Ross's pet monkey is shooting a commercial in New York, and they try to see them. There's a bunch of guest stars in this episode. Which star did not appear in this episode? Was it Brooke Shields, George Clooney, Julia Roberts, or Jean-Claude Van Damme?
One did or did not?
Did not appear in this episode. Brooke Shields, George Clooney, Julia Roberts, Jean-Claude Van Damme. Andrew, since you're first, you can go first.
Brooke Shields.
Your guess is Brooke Shields. And Andy.
I feel like, it was, I don't remember much about George Clooney other than he was side by side with Noah Wyle, and they showed up as like the two handsome young doctors.
Love AR.
Chicago. I can't imagine that they did that more than once. So I don't remember.
That's a good point.
Was Chandler Bing dating Julia Roberts? I don't remember that much about. I'm going to say Brooke Shields too, because I don't freaking know, man.
Okay. The correct answer was, in fact, George Clooney.
He's right, because he was already in it once. It'd be kind of weird for him to appear again. That's a good point.
All right. So final score is Andrew 9, Andy 7.
This is shocking. Truly shocking.
Thank you so much for playing. I'm sorry. I thought Andrew would not do this well. This is a genuine surprise to me, Andy.
Ask me about like what label Liz Fair was on, or Elastica in 1996. Come on, so it wasn't like that.
I should have catered it more to your wheelhouse. I apologize.
It was diverse.
I thought we would get him with the sports questions. All right.
Yeah.
But let's get back to 90 Days in the 90s. You know, one thing I don't recall if we addressed was the title, since it has a lot to do with the constraints on time travel. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Do you want to tell us about what is 90 Days? What is the 90 Days about?
So, originally there was a couple other working titles to this, one of which was Rewind, because I was thinking like of a mixtape or something. But there's a couple working titles, and I think at one point when I was working with my editor, she went through like my second draft. It was like, this is great. Darby gets to go back in time, but if there's not constraints there, and she kind of come and goes as she pleases, then it doesn't really make for a good plot. You think about, when you see movies that, with Bruce Willis or Keanu Reeves in them, and there's a bomb. If the bomb doesn't go off in a certain amount of time, then, does he really have to go around does he ever have to get around to defusing the bomb, or can we just kind of hope the bomb doesn't blow up? So there's that dynamic. And, I don't have an MFA. I didn't go to college for writing. I never took any like formal writing courses. I learned a lot of this stuff organically and use a lot of common sense and so on. So, but I took that note from the editor. I thought, okay, well, I needed to kind of tighten up my time travel method. And this is, kind of early in the story. And, just kind of came up like 90 days. Like, what was her time span? It could be a year. Like I came up with 90 days in the 90s as just kind of a catchy constraint. And then I had to kind of invent something that would limit her. So there's, in addition to the gray line, which is the time travel mechanism, it's a train that you get. If you can find it, you just take it back to any year from 1947 to the present. So 1947 was actually when the CTA, Chicago Transit Authority, was established in Chicago. So I just kind of took that as a note too. But I kind of wrestled for a while with who dictates whether is it magic? Like what happens? And I came up with I don't own an Apple Watch, but I know a lot of people who do. Maybe you guys have Apple Watches on your wrist right now. I was just kind of thinking, like, what if she found this thing that, she mistakes as an Apple Watch? It's not that. It's actually, a time travel kind of a timer, but also gives you access to the gray line. So not, any schmo on the street can just find it and stumble in, which would be another kind of interesting subplot, but they didn't go with that. So then it just kind of came up that 90 Days in the 90s was a lot more catchy of a title than anything else I was working with. I was thinking like massive transit would be kind of a cool, like, nod to the train. And then, but like you pick up, I would hope that if you see this book in a bookstore or online, 90 Days in the 90s, you know exactly what it's about already. So I don't have to explain. I mean, I actually did have one friend of a friend who's like, so is this fiction? And I'm like, well, what do you think? It's time travel. As far as I know, I'll let you know if I find
based on a true story.
I hope I won't get stuck in the past, but it was just kind of catchy. It just kind of worked. I wanted to have Darby have like, she has to make a decision whether when she goes back to 1996 in the 90s, is she going to stay there, or does she can come back to the present, but she's got to make a decision. And then there's the other subplot is like, if you could travel back in time, you might go back to 1996. With the constraints that she has, she can go back to other years. And then for the music fans here, she does go back to review the first show Nirvana played in Chicago 33 days after the release of Smells Like Teen Spirit. And then there's some other opportunities. She makes actually a newspaper column out of it, reviewing vintage shows, and only she and another person who turns up also as a time traveler in the novel know that she's actually going back to check out these shows that she, like music fans would be like, yeah, I'd love to go see Jimi Hendrix play at the Isle of Wight, his last ever show, or I'd love to go back to Woodstock. That's something that music fans really talk about. Mm-hmm. So I kind of let her do that to a certain extent. But it's all got to be in the constraints of 90 days. She's got to make a decision, which she kind of sort of maybe does. And then she's stuck with her, making her decision about, staying back in time or maybe coming back to the present. But it just kind of all worked. Having constraints, I think, It's like we have rules for baseball and basketball. We have gravity that kind of keeps us from floating up in the air. Like constraints are good, and then you learn to invent around them. And I think that works in fiction too.
Speaking of friends, Darby has a lot of interesting friends and characters in her life. We have her best friend Spiro, her, I would say, kind of her first real love, Lena, one of the major X that we're introduced to. We have Spacey, who's one of her record store employees, her three roommates, just a list of people, Tam, Rye, Nancy, and they all have, like you were saying earlier, like their own styles and music tastes, and it sounds like they've become living people in your head. Or were they originally based off of, were any of them kind of based off of people in your life, or are they just kind of constructs of people that you've met and turned into your own people?
Yeah, there's a little of both. I mean, Spiro and Rye guy, who's kind of the Stifler type of always has to be an asshole kind of a person. They're actually like two of my friends where I took certain things about the personality and turned them way up, So one thing that my editor told me, and one thing that I've learned from taking improv classes for years, is if you've got you think about like a character in one movie from the 90s, came out in 1990 that I love is Goodfellas. We all love Goodfellas. What's the name of that character? Johnny Two Times? Like, get the papers.
Oh, yeah.
That's all we know about him. But for a split second, he's a character that's memorable in Goodfellas because he says the same thing twice. And that's sometimes you take bits of people's personality and turn them up to like 200%. And that's sort of what I did with some of the characters. So Spiro is like, he's a grad student. He's Darby's best friend. Sort of when she comes back to 1996, she started hanging out with him and realizing she kind of remembers his quirks, like that he's kind of like this. This is a stereotype of or a psychograph of a lot of grad students who haven't been out in the real world. And I was one of them, like kind of a pseudo socialist, always hanging out in coffee houses, drinking coffee, raging about the revolution or whatever. Took that. I have a friend who's kind of like that, but of course I turned it way up. And my friend Brian, who is kind of a wise guy, I think I kind of wonder if he was the original, kind of the inspiration for Cho, the MILF guy in American Pie. Because I actually remember Brian using the term MILF in the late 90s or mid 90s, and I was like, I don't know what the heck he was talking about. Just kind of like he's a Japanese American guy who's kind of a wise ass, and so I turned those kind of pieces up 100% when they're on the trip to Europe. So yeah, yes and no, but then there's other characters that I don't force it, but I feel like the characters like the Spacey character, who's a record store employee. She's the only female employee. Darby's the owner, but she's working with two guys who are, I guess, probably like a lot of record store employees. They know everything about music. They know everything. And Spacey's kind of the smart ass girl who's younger than them and pushes back. And I kind of pictured like Billie Eilish. Like if Billie Eilish was working in a record store, because she likes Green Day and a lot of 90s bands, she kind of would be just sort of that employee that would have the last laugh and would know more than everyone else and just sort of rolls with that. And that's, I think all the characters I feel like are real, at least they would be real and presentable in the 90s as people you would know, but they also have roles and relationships with the main character that kind of push her buttons and make her think and say and do things that are integral to the story. So yeah, we all are, I guess like a lot of writers are influenced by stuff and people that happen in real life. They say you write what you know. But I got to play with that a little bit in terms of taking the personality quirks and turning them up way up. So.
It's interesting. Brandon and I were talking, I was talking about name selection in books. And there's something interesting where some names that an author choose, you just can't believe it. The names you've chosen seem believable. I'm curious what your process is, because sometimes it's just like someone pointed to a name in a book and then put it in the story. So how do the names come about? I'm just curious.
I think I played with it. So if you take Kerouac and On the Road, the main character is Sal Paradise, and maybe it was Paradisi, who's an Italian-American guy from New Jersey who just gets wanderlust. His name isn't as real sounding as his sidekick, Dean Moriarty, who basically starts with the story. He wants to go out and hang out with, Dean's out in, San Francisco or Denver or somewhere, and he basically is bored in the suburbs and needs to go hunt down his friend and, have adventures. I think we just play with things. Darby's surname was a little. I really originally was thinking it was Darby Purdue, and I was thinking like Generation Purdue, which is what they called Hemingway and some of the Americans who hung out, the writers who hung out in Paris. I thought that felt a little forced, and I wanted her name to be a little more punchy for the flap copy on the back of the book, and maybe just when I was pitching literary agents and so on. So I just kind of made some decisions, and things evolved, and some people you don't really know their last names. Spacey actually, so I used to cover roller derby when I wrote for ESPN, and kind of one cultural thing about roller derby is a lot of people like will go by their derby names. Like, so my friend Val Capone goes by Val Capone. Like, she doesn't go by her birth name, and she's I don't think she plays skates anymore, but she does like pro wrestling announcing, which is perfect for her. If you met her, I joke about Val. She's like a perfect combination between Mike Ditka and Katy Perry. You met her, you'd be like, yeah, that's, and she actually loves that description. So there's that dynamic. And I thought, well, I was coming up with this character. I wanted her to be, kind of real to what I knew. And it's kind of sounds like a real name, but it's like, so you kind of assume if you read into it that she plays derby or she goes to derby practice and that she must be going by that name. Otherwise, I have to come up with a name that, like Alice Smith or something that doesn't work in a record store. You can try. But like, there's Rachel. Rachel's name is Rachel Murray. And that's like a totally believable, like Midwestern female, a woman's name. And you got to kind of balance the ones that are punchy with the ones that are just like, just sort of regular.
Yeah.
The people there, lots of people with the last name Williams or Johnson or Scott, but there can't be too many of them. Otherwise it gets confusing.
One final question before we let you go, because we're almost out of time. I was curious about the dreaded letters, because they're Darcy's favorite, or not Darcy, Darby's favorite band, and they kind of play. Read the book to find out. But are they based on any band in particular? Because you mentioned the Pumpkins concert where your friend was like one of 17 people there, and there's kind of a similar anecdote in this story. And also, how is Velvet Morning not an album name already? Because that is brilliant.
Yeah, I actually like crowdsourced that through my Facebook friends, who the ones who were actually interested in me writing a book 2-3 years ago. I was coming up with names, and I was kind of, like you're saying about the person names, like, does it sound too pretentious? I think the band's original name was Frightwire, but then I had a friend who'd be like, yeah, that seems like one of those, a friend of mine who's really opinionated about music, like, sounds like one of those douchey techno bands. So I was like, well, okay, let me take that under advisement. And I just kind of crowdsourced a couple of names. I think Velvet Morning was one and Dreaded Letters the other, and people like both. And I kind of came up with like, okay, Velvet Morning is the name of the album, and Dreaded Letters just sounds like one thing that there was not in the 90s was kind of okay, so there are a couple trios like Green Day, but there wasn't really kind of like a middle of the road rock trio that was more about their instrumentation, like the Police in the 70s and early 80s, or the Jimi Hendrix Experience. There were Slater Kinney, but they weren't really well known until maybe now, and there's only a certain number of us who really follow them. So I kind of just thought about a seminal rock trio that's all about the musicianship, and I just befitted them with a name that sort of spoke to, I don't know, maybe what they would sound like. So yeah, it was maybe an amalgam of like concepts but not really mimicking a certain band with a different name. I just felt like there's a place for, if Darby's going to travel back in time and she's really getting into the music, maybe one of the things is that, there's this band that she kind of discovered, or maybe not. And does she go back in time to sort of, stake her claim on this band that's now in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, that she was one of the first, that's another music thing. Like, if you were a music writer, you probably have a band that nobody knew about back when they were nobodies, and you knew about them. And does it drive you to sort of want to reveal them to the world? So that's one of the dynamics. That's, a plot point that I think music fans might enjoy in this book, because I also think if you're in a music scene, there's always that dynamic of like, who's the next Nirvana, Guns N' Roses, Hendrix, Strokes, whatever it is. There's always that ever-present question that pops up, and that's the inspiration for the Dreaded Letters, the band.
Very cool. I just to get in, I was waiting for a Slater Kinney reference in the book, and I was not disappointed. The mixtape was interesting. I liked the inclusion of L7 on there as well. Thank you, Andy, for joining us today.
Yes, thank you so much.
Thanks. I appreciate you guys having me on. And anytime I can talk about music for an hour plus is good for me.
Awesome. Well, that's it for our September special. Thank you so much to Andy Frye, author of 90 Days in the 90s, for coming on. Can you let our listeners know one more time where to find you, your book, anything that should be out in the world?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to check out the book or order it, you can go to 90daysand90s.com. Cool part about it is that, it's direct from me. I'll sign it, send you some swag, and the artist gets to keep a little more money. But if you're an avid Amazon user, you need to buy some air filters for your air conditioner or some socks, and you're on there already. You can obviously find 90 Days in the 90s at Amazon like you could any other book. And yeah, I mean, just other than that, check me out on Twitter or Insta. I'm at @SportyFrye with an E on the end. And other than that, I'll be, probably at a show that you're at sometime soon in the crowd somewhere.
Very cool. And you can find all that info down in the description below. And yeah, as always, you can find us on Twitter and Instagram at Namely90s with a 90S, or find our personal accounts on Twitter at bshwitty and at NamelyAndrew, and tell us what you want us to talk about on future episodes. If you'd like to support the show, please check out our Patreon, patreon.com/Namely90s, also with a 90S. And finally, you can contact us through our website, Namely90s.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Hot Tub Time Machine, Deezer, TuneIn, iHeart, YouTube, and wherever you get your podcasts from. I'm Brandon. That's Andrew. Thank you one final time to Andy Frye, author of 90 Days in the 90s. And we'll catch you next time.
Why'd you guys pick 90s?